Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, Mike Pompeo, the US Secretary of State, heads to Ethiopia from Angola whilst on his tour of the continent. It's the first from a Washington cabinet official in 18 months. Also, the last South African president to lead under apartheid, F.W. de Klerk, apologises for saying that white minority rule was not a crime against humanity. And Salt River in Cape Town has long struggled with high levels of crime and unemployment, but an annual art festival is making inroads into slowly changing the community's dynamic. We hear more from our correspondent on the ground. But first, the US Secretary of State headed to Ethiopia from Luanda on Monday as he continues on his tour of Africa and the Gulf. Whilst in Angola, Mike Pompeo congratulated the country's president for cracking down on corruption. Pompeo's trip to the continent is the first by a cabinet official in a year and a half. The Pentagon's also considering slashing its military presence on the continent, and Washington's brought in new immigration restrictions that target Nigerians, Sudanese, Tanzanians, and Eritreans. Monty Francis tells us more about the US's relations with Africa.
In Angola, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo praised the country's president for fighting corruption. But there's another fight taking center stage during Pompeo's tour of Africa. It's the battle against terrorism in the Sahel region, where West African countries are fighting Islamist militants with the help of U.S. and French forces. The U.S. has a military presence in several African countries with a total of 6,000 troops. That includes 500 Special Operation Forces in Somalia and 800 personnel in West Africa. Pompeo is trying to reassure African allies following reports that U.S. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper was weighing a troop reduction to devote more resources to Asia and Europe.
We'll get it right. We'll get it right collectively. I'm convinced of that. European partners, French and United States of America, we have an obligation to get security right here in the region.
The French have about 5,000 troops in the region, and President Emmanuel Macron says they count on the U.S. for air support and logistics. U.S. officials have said a decision on possible reduction in troop levels is expected sometime next month.
Now, the last South African president to lead under apartheid has apologised for saying that white minority rule was not a crime against humanity. F.W. de Klerk and anti-apartheid icon Nelson Mandela were both awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993 for their roles in ending political and social segregation. But the 83-year-old's remarks this month disappointed many South Africans and led to a rowdy protest in Parliament by opposition EFF lawmakers last week. Aisha Ishmael joins us now with more from South Africa. Aisha, so you actually spoke to de Klerk this month, at which point he acknowledged that apartheid was wrong. Just a little while later, he went on to make these very controversial statements that apartheid did not equate to crimes against humanity. How do you make sense of that contradiction?
Well, that is correct, Georgia. On the 2nd of February, it was the 30th anniversary of F.W. de Klerk's historic speech that he made in Parliament, which led to the release of political prisoners, and notably Nelson Mandela, and also the unbanning of liberation movements and the return of political asylum, of political prisoners. So I did that interview with him, and he said and acknowledged that apartheid was wrong and morally unjustifiable. He subsequently did an interview with a public broadcaster, and he was asked whether he believed that apartheid was a crime against humanity. And he then said no, and said that apartheid was not a crime that could be compared to genocide. And of course, that then angered a lot of people, including the economic freedom fighters. And we saw on the 13th of February last week with the State of the Nation address, where the EFF stood up in Parliament and demanded that F.W. de Klerk be ejected from the National Assembly. And the very next day, the F.W. de Klerk Foundation released a statement supporting the former president and saying that apartheid was not a crime against humanity. That caused a huge outcry and uproar in South Africa, to the extent where the ANC, the Tutu Foundation, which is the Desmond and Leah Foundation, as well as the South African Communist Party, released a statement condemning F.W. de Klerk and the foundation. And that then led to the foundation releasing a statement today, and F.W. de Klerk saying that it was wrong of the foundation to have released that statement, and that they do believe that apartheid was a crime against humanity, and withdraw that statement and apologized for the hurt that it caused.
That was a surprisingly circuitous route to get to what most people would think would be a pretty obvious conclusion. But either way, does it still matter what de Klerk thinks about apartheid one way or the other?
Well, if one just looks at social media in South Africa and what people are saying on social media platforms, some are saying that F.W. de Klerk is irrelevant, and that when one looks at role models and in terms of reconciliation, they do not think of F.W. de Klerk. Others, people on the other hand, are angry about this, and they're actually calling for his Nobel Peace Prize to be revoked.
Thanks very much. Aisha Ishmael there for us in Cape Town. Now, in Rwanda, a popular gospel singer who was found guilty of conspiracy to murder the president died in police custody. Police claim that 38-year-old Kizito Mihigo killed himself whilst in a police cell. Mihigo was a huge star in Rwanda. He was pardoned in 2018, but rearrested last week, allegedly trying to flee to Burundi. News of his suicide has been met with skepticism in some circles. And 24 people were killed in an attack on a church in northern Burkina Faso over the weekend. Armed men attacked Panzi in Yaga province on Sunday during a Protestant service. Christians and churches in northern provinces in the country have increasingly come under attack by armed Islamists. Now to Cape Town, where an annual arts festival has been breathing life into the economy of one particular community for about 4 years now. Sam Bradpiece headed down to Salt River for us over the weekend. Take a look.
One of 28 artists taking part in this year's annual public arts festival here in Salt River, Cape Town, is Jakes behind me, who's transforming this building into somewhat of a visual masterpiece. Jakes, if we can just have a word, can you explain to us what is it that you're doing here today?
I'm bringing a new kind of inspiration. You know, this is a student residency, and it's obviously young people who are going to be living here. So why not bring change into their life? Every time they pass here, maybe from a gloomy day, they see these bright colors, they get inspired.
That's awesome, Jakes. I'll let you get back to work. Thank you. Now, Jakes is among the many artists who've played a significant role over the last 4 years in completely visually transforming this community, also bringing certain social and economic benefits with that. Salt River was hit hard by deindustrialisation in the 1980s, and its predominantly black community was hit further by prolonged recession in the 90s. Today, though, tourists flock to the area to see the art both during and outside festival season. A whole industry has grown up around this festival, although not everybody is convinced at the benefits that this festival brings. What do you say to those who say that this festival and street art generally is leading to a kind of slow gentrification of the area? What do you have to say to that?
What I have to say to that is that I've been involved with this project for the last 4 years from the very beginning, and it's always been very inclusive of the community. Street art is reflective of the community. How could we exclude them?
So it really does seem, from speaking to Anthea and others like her, that arts and culture really can benefit the community, and not just in a visual sense.
Sam Bradpiece there for us in the mix in Cape Town. Now, in Mali, 80% of the population rely on agriculture for their livelihoods, but climate change is threatening food security and forcing local entrepreneurs to find new ways to grow their crops. Pierre Delheux tells us more.
This high-tech greenhouse is the first of its type in Mali. Built in 2011, the farm now employs over 30 workers, most of them women, and produces tomatoes, melons, cucumbers, lemons, and strawberries.
When I first came here, I was amazed. I take care of tomatoes from planting all the way to harvesting.
The greenhouse complex was designed and created by Malian architect Amadou Sidibé. A supercomputer controls the whole farm. Linked to a drip-feed irrigation system, it assures that crops get the right amount of water and nutrients, but also regulates the temperature and recycles the water it uses. Water management is the most important element for helping farms like this adapt to a changing climate.
In the time of our grandfathers, it used to rain and the cycles were regular. With human activity, you find that the rains are more and more irregular, the droughts more and more frequent, and we no longer control the water. If we no longer control that, we don't control agriculture.
With jihadist groups roaming the northern desert region of Mali, where water reserves are precariously low, access to arable land is scarce, causing tensions between the communities seeking their share of dwindling resources.
When we grow tomatoes outside, a plant can barely produce 2 to 3 kilos per square meter. Here we reach 20 kilos. The world record is 75 kilos per square meter. It's in Quebec. We will get there one day in Africa.
Sidibé has also helped create 2 other greenhouses in Mali and mentors farmers in Niger and Chad. His focus, improving food security for countries struggling with climate change and widespread poverty.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa. Thanks very much for joining us. Do so again. Take care.